Put those barriers down right now. I do not care what he says. That bridge belongs to this community." Those were the first words I heard when I pulled my truck around the bend and saw two contractors dragging concrete blocks across the only road leading into the northern half of my ranch. Standing behind them in white slacks and oversized sunglasses was Vanessa Crowley, president of the Stonehaven Ridge Homeowners Association, arms folded like she was posing for the cover of a magazine called Other People's Property. She saw me stop, lowered her sunglasses, and gave me a smile that said she had been hoping I would show up. I did not get out of the truck. I did not raise my voice. And I definitely did not touch those barriers. I just put the transmission in park, lifted my phone, and started recording because by then I knew something Vanessa did not. The bridge she was blockading was described in black ink inside my recorded deed. Every pier, every rail, every square foot of ground beneath it belonged to me. My name is Russell Mercer. I was 54 when this happened. And for almost 30 years I worked as a transportation engineer for 3 counties across northern Arkansas, which meant I spent most of my adult life studying roads, drainage systems, easements, right-of-way maps, and the creative ways people misunderstand the phrase public access. I had seen farmers lose strips of land because they trusted a handshake, developers spend millions because nobody checked an old plat, and local officials swear a road was public until somebody walked into court carrying a deed from 1937. I knew documents mattered. I knew patience mattered more. And I knew the loudest person in a land dispute was usually the one who had done the least homework. Still, none of that was why I bought the ranch. I bought it because my wife, Elaine, died, and the house we had shared for 26 years became unbearable after she was gone. She had pancreatic cancer. The kind of that arrives quietly and then steals time faster than anyone can understand. We had 11 months from diagnosis to funeral, 11 months of hospital rooms, whispered conversations, casseroles from neighbors, and me pretending I believe every new treatment might be the one. After she died, I kept working because routine was the only thing holding me upright. But at night I would sit in our kitchen and stare at the empty chair across from me, listening to the refrigerator hum like it had something important to say. Elaine had always wanted land, not a fancy lake house or some gated retirement community, just woods, water, and enough distance from the nearest neighbor that you could walk outside in your bathrobe without becoming local news. About a year after the funeral, I started looking. That was how I found the Granger property. 3,800 acres outside a small town called Red Hollow, a mixture of oak forest, pasture, limestone bluffs, and nearly 2 miles of frontage along the Little Cypress River. The Granger family had owned it since 1952, but the last owner, Amos Granger, died without children, and his nieces wanted the estate settled quickly. The price was $875,000, which was more money than I had ever spent on anything, but I sold the old house, used most of my retirement savings, and signed the papers on a rainy morning in March. The title package was thick enough to stop a door, 61 pages of boundary calls, historical references, creek crossings, abandoned wagon roads, and language nobody had bothered modernizing since Eisenhower was president. Most buyers would have skimmed it and trusted the title company. I read every page because that was the kind of man Elaine used to tease me about. She would say, "Russell, you are the only person alive who reads appliance warranties for entertainment." She was not wrong. The bridge appeared in 3 separate descriptions. A narrow, reinforced concrete span built by Amos Granger's father in 1947 to move cattle and equipment across the river during flood season. Decades later, a developer named Raymond Sutter bought a ridge on the opposite side and built a private subdivision called Stonehaven Ridge. 92 homes with stone mailboxes, decorative streetlights, and enough landscaping rules to make a tomato plant nervous. Raymond needed access across the river, so he asked Amos if residents could use the old ranch bridge. Amos said yes. No contract, no payment, no recorded easement, just permission between 2 men who probably believed their word would outlive them. Stonehaven paved the road approaching the bridge, painted the rails every few years, installed a gate on their side, and slowly began speaking about the bridge as though they owned it. Amos never challenged them because he rarely used that section of the ranch. And as long as nobody bothered his cattle, he had better things to do. That casual arrangement survived almost 25 years, long enough for permission to turn into assumption, assumption to turn into policy, and policy to turn into Vanessa Crowley wearing a laminated president badge at 9 in the morning. I learned about the bridge ownership 2 weeks after closing when my surveyor, a soft-spoken man named Martin Keene, showed up at the ranch office holding a rolled map and wearing the expression of somebody about to tell me my dog could talk. He spread the survey across a plywood table, pointed to the river crossing and said, "Russell, Stonehaven does not own this bridge." I leaned closer. He tapped the boundary line again. "You own the bridge, both approaches, the riverbed beneath it, and 14 feet of land beyond the eastern rail. Their gate is actually 3 feet inside your parcel." I remember letting out one small laugh, not because it was funny, but because sometimes the truth is so absurd your body has to react somehow. I went home that evening, made coffee, and read the entire title package again. Martin was right. There was no easement, no transfer, no reservation, nothing giving Stonehaven permanent access. The subdivision had been crossing private property for almost a quarter century because Amos Granger had been neighborly. I did not celebrate. 92 families relied on that bridge, families with children, elderly parents, jobs, deliveries, ambulances, and school buses. I had no interest in trapping anyone or turning a legal technicality into a payday, but I also knew unrecorded access was dangerous for everyone, especially the owner carrying the liability, which was now me. I decided to inspect the area before speaking to anyone. 3 mornings later, I was driving along a gravel lane on my own side of the river when a black Cadillac SUV came flying up behind me, horn blaring. It pulled beside my truck, and Vanessa Crowley lowered her window. She looked to be in her late 50s, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and deeply offended by my existence. "You're inside a restricted community access zone," she said. I told her I own the Granger Ranch. She smiled like a teacher correcting a slow student. "The ranch boundary ends west of this road. This corridor belongs to Stonehaven Ridge," I said. "I have a registered survey showing otherwise." Her smile disappeared. "Then your surveyor made a mistake. Turn around before I call the sheriff." I could have shown her the deed right there, but something in her tone told me information would only make her louder. So I nodded, backed my truck away, and drove home. That afternoon I called a property attorney named Claire Donnelly, sent her the deed, the survey, and every closing document I had. She called me the next morning and said, "Russell, I've checked county records back to 1947. The bridge is yours. The approach is yours. And Stonehaven has no recorded easement of any kind." Then she paused and added, "Do not contact them yet. Let us see what they do when they think you do not know that." 4 days later, a certified letter arrived from Vanessa accusing me of trespassing on HOA property and threatening legal action if I approached their bridge again. I read it twice, placed it in a new folder marked Evidence, and called Claire. She listened while I read the letter aloud. Then she laughed once and said, "Well, that was faster than expected. Russell, keep the envelope, keep the signature receipt, and do not respond." I asked her why. "Because," she said, "Vanessa Crowley has just put her first false claim in writing, and people like her almost never stop at one." She was right. Vanessa did not stop at one. Within 2 weeks, the Stonehaven board had sent 3 more letters, each more dramatic than the last. And by the 4th one, I had apparently become a threat to public safety, neighborhood stability, emergency access, property values, and, according to one especially imaginative paragraph, the emotional well-being of senior residents. I had not closed the bridge, touched the gate, demanded money, or even spoken to Vanessa since the morning on the gravel road, but she was building a story in which I had arrived from nowhere with a deed in one hand and a ransom note in the other. Claire told me to remain quiet, so I did. Though staying quiet is harder than people think when somebody's lying about you with professional enthusiasm. My first real window into Stonehaven came from a resident named Harold Finch, a retired high school principal who had lived there for 17 years. He called me one evening and said, "Mr. Mercer, I hope you do not mind, but I got your number from the county property record. Vanessa told us you are preparing to demolish the bridge unless the HOA pays you $200,000. I was standing in my kitchen sink when he said it, looking out at a field where 3 deer were eating clover, and I remember thinking that $200,000 was oddly specific for a number I had never mentioned. I told Harold the truth, that I had made no demand, that I had not threatened to close the bridge, and that the HOA had sent me 4 letters claiming ownership of land described in my deed. He was silent for a long moment, then asked if I could prove it. I emailed him the survey and the first cease and desist letter. The next morning he called back and sounded 10 years older. "Russell," he said, "she told us you sent that letter to her." That was the first crack in Vanessa's version of events. And once one crack appears, people start noticing the rest. Harold introduced me to two other residents, a widow named June Talbot and a contractor named Marcus Reed, both of whom remembered Amos Granger openly telling residents they could use his bridge whenever they needed. June remembered him standing beside his cattle trailer at a neighborhood picnic saying, "You folks are welcome to cross as long as you do not scare my cows." Marcus remembered repairing a section of railing 12 years earlier and asking Amos whether the HOA needed written permission. Amos had laughed and said, "Written permission for being neighborly. Now I have heard everything." Claire took sworn statements from all three of them because those memories mattered. Stonehaven's attorney, a polished man from Little Rock named Grant Hollister, had started hinting at a prescriptive easement, which meant the HOA planned to argue that 25 years of open and continuous use had created a permanent right to cross. That argument sounded powerful until you understood one small detail. A prescriptive right generally requires use without permission. Amos had given permission freely, repeatedly, and in front of witnesses. The HOA had not taken the bridge from him. They had borrowed it with his blessing. And borrowed property does not become yours just because you repaint the railing. Claire called that the permission problem. I called it the part where common sense finally met paperwork. Vanessa, meanwhile, was not interested in common sense. She filed complaints with the county road department, the planning office, code enforcement, and the sheriff. A deputy named Travis Boone came to the ranch after she reported that I had installed an illegal barricade. We drove to the bridge together and found it completely open. Travis looked at the empty road, looked at me, then checked his notes. She said there were steel gates and armed guards. I pointed toward a cow leaning against a fence post and said, "That is the only guard I have. And she takes lunch seriously." Travis tried not to laugh, failed, and wrote in his report that no obstruction existed. A county inspector named Leland Price came out 3 days later to investigate an unpermitted commercial roadway. I showed him the deed and survey. He spent half an hour walking the boundary, then said, "Mr. Mercer, as far as I can tell, the HOA gate is on your property, not the other way around." I asked whether he planned to tell Vanessa. He said, "I plan to write it in a report, which usually causes more pain." By early summer, Vanessa had moved her campaign online. Stonehaven had a private neighborhood page where she posted updates with titles like Bridge Crisis Day 12 and Protecting Our Families from Outside Interests. June sent me screenshots. Vanessa accused me of purchasing the ranch specifically to seize community infrastructure, even though the sale had been negotiated months before I knew the bridge existed. She claimed I had refused mediation, though nobody had invited me to mediation. She claimed the bridge had always belonged to Stonehaven, though she never produced a deed. Then she contacted a regional television station. A reporter named Natalie Brooks arrived at the ranch on a humid Thursday afternoon with a cameraman and the careful expression of somebody expecting an angry landowner with a shotgun. Instead, I invited them into the old ranch office, made coffee, and laid the documents across a table. Natalie read the recorded description, studied Martin's survey, and compared them with the letters Vanessa had sent me. She looked up and said, "So the HOA accused you of trespassing on a bridge you legally own. That appears to be what happened. Are you planning to close it?" I told her I wanted a lawful, safe, permanent agreement that protected the residents and protected me. But I was not going to sign away property rights because somebody in a blazer had declared them inconvenient. The story aired that weekend. Vanessa declined an on-camera interview, but her written statement described me as a predatory investor exploiting a technical defect in community records. That phrase stayed with me. Technical defect. Because the defect was not technical at all. They simply did not own the bridge. After the broadcast, my inbox filled with messages, some supportive, some angry, some written in capital letters by people who believe punctuation was a sign of weakness. One message, however, changed the direction of everything. It came from a retired bridge inspector named Calvin Ross, who had evaluated the structure 6 years earlier for Stonehaven. He attached a copy of his report. The expansion joints were deteriorating. Water was entering the deck. Sections of the concrete showed spalling, and one abutment had early signs of steel corrosion. Calvin had recommended immediate maintenance, followed by a major rehabilitation within 5 years, estimated at $160,000. The HOA had received the report, discussed it privately, and done almost nothing beyond resurfacing the entrance. I called Claire as soon as I finished reading. "We need a new inspection," I said. "Not next month now." Claire hired Dr. Maya Ellison, a structural engineer from Fayetteville who had spent 28 years evaluating bridges and had the bedside manner of a woman who did not care whether concrete found her charming. She arrived with a 4-person team, testing equipment, underwater cameras, core drills, and enough hard hats to make the ranch look like a construction documentary. I stayed nearby while they worked, watching Maya crawl beneath the deck, tack concrete with a hammer, measure cracks, and stare at the eastern abutment with the kind of disappointment most people reserve for relatives. Late in the afternoon, she climbed back onto the bank, pulled off her gloves, and said, "Russell, people should not be driving heavy vehicles over this without restrictions." Her full report arrived 4 days later. The deck had advanced deterioration in 5 locations. The expansion seals had failed. Moisture had reached reinforcing steel, and corrosion was active in both eastern support sections. The bridge had been rated for highway loads decades earlier, but no valid recertification had occurred since the deterioration began. Maya recommended immediate weight limits, emergency stabilization, and full rehabilitation. Claire came to the ranch that evening, sat across from me at the kitchen table, and explained the sentence I already understood but did not want to hear. "You own it," she said, "which means now that you know about the danger, the liability is yours. If a moving truck breaks through tomorrow, Vanessa may have ignored the warning for 6 years, but your name is on the deed today." That was the moment the dispute stopped being ridiculous and became dangerous. 92 families crossed that bridge every day, including school buses, delivery trucks, propane vehicles, ambulances, and fire engines. And the HOA president was spending money on lawyers while water ate its way into the steel beneath their tires. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about Elaine, about all those months when safety became a series of decisions nobody wanted to make, and how pretending a problem was not serious never made it less serious. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Claire and I built a formal easement proposal. Permanent access recorded with the county, an annual fee of $14,000 divided among 92 homes, mandatory repairs funded by the HOA, professional inspections every 3 years, and a reserve account that could not be rated for landscaping contests or clubhouse furniture. The cost per household came to less than $13 a month, which was not extortion, unless Vanessa considered 2 coffees and a muffin an organized crime operation. We also issued a 60-day safety notice. If no agreement was reached, the bridge would be posted at a 3-ton limit based on Dr. Ellison's recommendation. Passenger cars could cross, but fire engines, school buses, moving vans, and heavy service trucks could not. Vanessa responded within 6 hours. Her attorney called the proposal unlawful, coercive, and evidence of malicious intent. Vanessa posted online that I was threatening to endanger children. Then, at a county commission meeting, she stood behind a microphone and demanded the county seize the bridge as a public necessity. The county attorney reviewed my deed, adjusted his glasses, and told her the county could not simply take private property because an HOA had forgotten to secure an easement. Vanessa leaned toward the microphone and said, "Then use eminent domain." The attorney replied, "That requires compensation, public purpose findings, environmental review, funding, and likely litigation. Do you have several $1,000,000 available?" Vanessa said the community should not have to pay for something it already owned. The attorney looked down at the deed and said, "Mrs. Crowley, that appears to be the entire problem." By then, residents were beginning to turn. Harold, June, Marcus, and several others demanded a special membership meeting under the HOA bylaws because the repair cost exceeded the board's spending authority. Vanessa resisted, delayed, misplaced one petition, and claimed 2 signatures were illegible. But the homeowners submitted everything again by certified mail. She had 45 days to schedule the vote. The date was set for October 17. Claire prepared 3 binders of evidence. Maya agreed to present the structural findings. Martin prepared a clean boundary map large enough to project on a wall. I thought we were finally moving toward a real conversation. But Vanessa had one more move left. 5 days before the meeting, I drove toward the bridge at sunrise and found two fresh concrete barriers sitting across my approach, two workers in orange vests beside them, and Vanessa standing in the road with her arms crossed. "Put the barriers up right now," she said. "I do not care what he says. He does not own this bridge." I stopped my truck, lifted my phone, and began recording as she looked directly into the camera and ordered the men to seal off land she had already been told, in writing, did not belong to her. I kept the camera steady and asked Vanessa one question: "Who authorized you to place barriers on this property?" She turned toward me slowly, but she'd been waiting for the line, and said, "The Stonehaven Board authorized it. This is community infrastructure, and you have no right to interfere." One of the workers glanced at the other, then at me, and I could tell neither man had been shown a deed, a survey, or anything beyond a work order and a check. I told them calmly that the land was privately owned, that the barriers were being placed without permission, and that I was recording the entire interaction. The older worker stopped immediately. Vanessa snapped, "Keep moving." He shook his head and said, "Mom, I am not getting arrested over a neighborhood argument." That was the first time I saw real panic move across her face. Not much, just a small tightening around the mouth, but it was there. She pulled out her phone and called the sheriff herself, which saved me the trouble. Deputy Travis Boone arrived 20 minutes later, looked at the barriers, looked at the survey pins, and then watched my recording from the beginning. Vanessa stood beside him explaining that the HOA had maintained the bridge for decades and therefore possessed operational control. Travis listened patiently, then asked whether she had written permission from the property owner to place the barriers. She pointed at me and said, "He is not the property owner." Travis opened the county parcel map on his tablet, compared it with Martin's registered survey, and said, "Mrs. Crowley, according to the county record, he is." Vanessa demanded that he arrest me for obstructing community access. Travis looked at the two concrete blocks she had ordered across the road and said, "The only person obstructing access right now appears to be you." The workers loaded the barriers back onto their trailer while Vanessa stood in the dust pretending the scene was somehow temporary. Before leaving, Travis handed her a written warning for unauthorized placement of objects on private property and told her any return without permission could be treated as trespassing. She looked at me and said, "You are going to regret humiliating me." I answered, "Vanessa, I have not said 10 words all morning. You handled the humiliation yourself." The video reached Stonehaven before I got home. One of the workers had apparently sent it to a supervisor. The supervisor sent it to a resident. And by lunchtime, half the neighborhood had seen their president ordering contractors to block land she did not own while a deputy explained the county map to her. Claire told me not to post it publicly, so I did not. We added it to the binder. 2 days later, Stonehaven's attorney filed a lawsuit claiming the HOA had acquired permanent access through decades of continuous use. Claire responded with the sworn statements from Harold, June, and Marcus, along with records showing Amos Granger had paid property taxes on the bridge parcel every year until his death. Grant Hollister argued that informal permission was too vague to defeat the HOA's claim. Claire answered with state cases establishing that permission did not become hostile merely because the user later forgot it was permission. She called me after filing the response and said, "Their entire case depends on pretending Amos never said yes." Unfortunately for them, 3 people remember him saying yes, and one of them is a retired principal who kept Christmas cards from 1998. The special meeting took place on October 17th in the Stonehaven clubhouse. The parking lot was so full that residents were leaving cars along both sides of the road. I arrived with Claire, Martin, and Dr. Ten, Maya Ellison, carrying 3 binders and a projector. Vanessa sat at the front beside Grant Hollister and 2 board members who looked like they had recently discovered that loyalty came with hourly legal fees. She opened the meeting by calling my proposal a hostile takeover of community property. She said the bridge was safe, the structural report was exaggerated, and the annual fee was nothing more than legalized extortion. Then Maya stood, placed photographs of corroded reinforcement and cracked concrete on the screen, and said, "Mrs. Crowley, concrete does not become less cracked because you dislike the engineer." That got the first laugh of the night. Vanessa did not enjoy it. Morton followed with the survey, showing the bridge, both approaches, the riverbed, and even part of the HOA gate inside my recorded boundary. Claire explained the legal history in plain English. Amos had allowed access. Permission prevented hostile use. No permanent easement had ever been recorded, and the current residents needed one if they wanted guaranteed access for future owners, lenders, insurers, and emergency services. Then, I walked to the front. I did not raise my voice. I told them I understood why people were afraid, because somebody had spent months telling them I wanted to trap them in their neighborhood. I said I had no desire to close the bridge, but I would not ignore a structural report or carry unlimited liability for infrastructure serving 92 homes. I put the proposal on screen. $14,000 a year, less than $13 per household each month, full repair funded from the HOA reserved, inspections every 3 years, and permanent recorded access that could not disappear when I died or sold the ranch. Then I showed them the reserve statement June had obtained under the bylaws. Stonehaven had $238,000 sitting in reserve while the bridge deteriorated. The room changed after that. People were no longer looking at me. They were looking at Vanessa. Harold stood and asked why the board had never disclosed the old inspection report. Marcus asked why legal fees had already exceeded $31,000. A mother near the back asked whether Vanessa had known school buses were crossing an uncertified bridge. Vanessa answered none of those questions directly. She called them distractions, accused residents of disloyalty, and finally shouted that without her leadership Stonehaven would collapse. June Talbot, who had barely spoken above a whisper during every conversation I had with her, stood up and said, "Vanessa, this neighborhood existed before your presidency, and I suspect it will survive your absence." The vote to accept the easement passed 78-9. The vote to remove Vanessa and the 2 board members who supported the lawsuit passed 74-13. Grant Hollister closed his laptop before the second tally was finished. Vanessa leaned toward him and demanded that he challenge the result. He said quietly, "The bylaws are clear." She told him to find another interpretation. He picked up his briefcase and said, "I will send the board my final invoice." 3 weeks later, the new HOA president, Harold Finch, signed the permanent easement in the county recorder's office. Repairs began in January under Maya's supervision. The bridge closed for 19 days. Residents used the longer route without the disaster Vanessa had promised. Contractors replaced the failed joints, repaired the damaged deck, treated the corroded steel, reinforced both eastern support sections, and installed proper drainage. When the work was completed, the bridge passed a full load test and received a new certification. The first vehicle across was a fire engine from Red Hollow, moving slowly through the morning mist while residents watched from both banks. I stood beside Harold and listened to the tires roll over the repaired deck, smooth and solid, and for the first time since the certified letters began, nobody was arguing about who owned what. Vanessa filed one final personal lawsuit accusing me of defamation and interference with her leadership. Claire sent her attorney a response containing the recorded deed, the survey, the sheriff's warning, the meeting transcript, and Vanessa's own barrier video. The lawsuit disappeared 11 days later. I never heard from her again. I built a small cabin above the Little Cypress River the following spring, with the porch facing east and enough space behind it for the garden Elaine always wanted. I planted tomatoes, lavender, and a row of peonies along the south wall, though I had no idea what I was doing and nearly killed half of them the first summer. Every morning I sat outside with coffee and watched mist rise from the water. Sometimes I could hear vehicles crossing the bridge in the distance. School buses, work trucks, families heading into town, ordinary sounds moving over something safe again. That bridge taught me a lesson I should have understood long before Vanessa arrived with her concrete barriers. People often confuse silence with weakness, patience with surrender, and long use with ownership. They assume that if nobody challenges them, they must be right. But time does not turn a false claim into a true one, and confidence does not replace a deed. I did not win because I shouted louder than Vanessa. I won because I documented everything, hired people who knew their work, and waited until the truth could be shown to everyone in the same room. So tell me honestly, was I right to demand a permanent easement and remove Vanessa from the negotiation? Or should I have allowed the neighborhood to keep using the bridge for free because they relied on it for so long? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you have ever watched an HOA treat private property like its personal kingdom, share that story too. Because somewhere out there, somebody may need to hear that the quiet person holding the records is not always the person who is losing.